Look, just watch and listen to this. Guys, I can't stress how incredible this is. Hello, my fellow sorcerers, and welcome back to my latest and, honestly, perhaps greatest build. This is not an updated version of anything we already know about, or a new twist on something we already know is good. This is a completely unique new creation that, truthfully, I have been working on since the pre-season, and now have finally had that eureka moment. The concept is simple, and it's a question I asked myself that I will now ask you. Wouldn't it be cool if, as a sorcerer, you could just kill a group of enemies by teleporting on top of them? And that's it. We have raiment, it groups, it stuns. Surely you can engineer that mechanic to just be enough to kill without any follow-up damage, follow-up abilities, so you can move at warp speed through dungeons, literally just teleport bombing every group of enemies. And as it turns out, you can! And teleport bomb is exactly what I call this. I cannot wait to give you the ins and outs, but you're seeing how amazing it flows and feels to quite literally lightning explosion your way at warp speed through a dungeon. And yes, it is, only a 46, but that's not exactly terrible, is it? You don't really need to ever go any higher unless you're trying to push Nightmare Dungeons just for the sake of it. But I would also point out that this is the ultimate farming build. XP against enemies just a bit higher than you, or legendaries in Helltides. In fact, look at it in a Helltide. It's glorious. You just hop from pack to pack to pack, they all die from just the teleport, and you just collect your embers. This got 0 to 250 embers in about 5 minutes. Which, yes, isn't the most insane thing in the world, but it did it by just moving around the map with teleport. No other investment, thought, skills needed, anything along those lines. And that's so sweet to be able to pull off and actually do. So, what is going on here? Well, it's a combination of a fair few synergies that I have been tinkering with for a fair while. To cut to the chase then, the concept at its core is simple. Teleport. Yeah, we love it. It's one of the best skills in the game. The movement, the damage is actually not too bad, and the lucky hit chance is great, but combined with raiment becomes insane, the grouping, and most importantly, the stun. We then add on top of that a little underutilized enchantment that is the Charged Bolts one, where there's a 40% chance to release 3 charged bolts. That means you teleport onto a group of 10 enemies, 4 of them will release 12 charged bolts in total. Can you leverage that to be enough damage to kill the entire group of enemies? Well, you're about to find out how exactly you do just that, and then some. And yes, it's pretty fun that this gets to use a not only staff instead of wand and focus for once, but the legendary Lamb Esen staff that did get a little bit buffed, and it's feeling really strong. So without further ado then, let's introduce and go over properly the ultimate teleport bomb. Skill tree for this then is rather satisfying. 2 ranks into Firebolt for the first enchantment slot, and yes, to reach the core skills, but we do want both the crit and burning damage synergy on top of what we're doing here. The goal is to do as much damage as humanly possible with just what happens when we teleport, and that helps us do just that. I should also mention at this early stage that there is a second part of this build in the form of Lightning Spear that does something very special, and we will get to it in detail how it works, but do get excited for that. I just really want to introduce it now because it's so freaking cool. Anyway, we've got the 2 points, so we move on to the cores, and all we get is, our core. Charged bolts to rank 5, and then we get enhanced. The third time an enemy is hit by a single cast, they explode. So remember that the enchantment slot releases 3, which means, it triggers this explosion, so you get that crash of thunder sound effect, which is so satisfying with your teleports multiple times. And then greater for an extra 25% damage to stunned enemies. All the enemies will be stunned because we're triggering this with Raiment, and this is a big bump as such. Over to your defensives, where we're getting 3 out of 4, so, quite the treat. Flame Shield to Shimmering, the emergency button. Teleport with max ranks in, because we want the cooldown to be as low as possible, as it's a big part of this setup. And then over to Shimmering for more survivability. We get maximum attunement this time, as we want to guarantee the reset, because a lot of the time the only defensive skill on cooldown will be teleport, and being able to double teleport here is really potent. We then get the one into Frost Nova all the way to Mystical for the vulnerable, for the freeze, and this helps a lot against any tankiest single target enemy. Then we get some more lucky hit, as we want as much as we can get, and then we grab the double defensive that is protection and mana shield, because yes, very occasionally we will be hard casting charged bolts, mainly against bosses, and this helps a lot with keeping you alive against said bosses. Then we get the 1 rank in Lightning Spear. Take it to enhanced, so the crit stats are stacking, and then take it to invoked. Now, I want you to kind of consider this. Lightning Spear will stun enemies when crit striking. This will mean that it will very quickly reach 100% crit chance on top of our natural crit chance. So this flies round the screen, and sometimes into the next screen in room 2, stunning every enemy it passes through, causing every enemy that it passes through to roll that 40% chance to fire out charged bolts. Which is what creates this room-wide situation where every enemy gets stunned and turns into a mini lightning nova that propagates across every other enemy and just auto-wipes out screens for you. It's so effective, and I cannot stress that enough, and it's why we take Lightning Spear over the 4th defensive in Ice Armor. It also is a cooldown, so we still get protection, and that's really good, and this thing is magic in this build. Down to the Masteries, where we get our Devouring Blaze for the extra crit damage, and that is that. And passives-wise here, we want to get the Shocking Impact, because we're stunning enemies constantly. And again, we want as much damage as possible from just the teleport. So this adds, well, this damage to that from the Raiment Stun. Over to our ultimates, we grab Unstable Currents and Prime Unstable Currents. This isn't really too core or needed here. You could even argue over for Deep Freeze, but this mainly exists for bosses or particularly troublesome elite packs if you need an extra bump and need to hardcast a few charged bolts. Then we get the extra crit chance, as crits are everything here, the Electrocute for more survivability from our crits, and then more chance to stun, because stun equals more charged bolts equals more goodness. Then for our passive, we get Via's Mastery, as it's the only one that really has a significant effect here, and the damage and survivability from it is genuinely quite nice. So that's how it all comes together then, and we end up with, this nice cozy setup. Frost Nova, any elites or bosses, get them vulnerable, do more damage to them, very simple. And then Flame Shield, I'm stunned, or I'm dying and I need to not be, or I just want to stand in something and be lazy, pop it. Everything else then is for certain situations. Unstable Currents, as I said, just for bosses when you need to actually blast along. Mana isn't great when we're not in combat, because we get a lot of our mana from stunning enemies, from the Paragon board that we'll get to, but then we have the main two heroes of this. So your teleport on top of enemies group, stun, release all of your charged bolts, and blow them up. Then the lightning spear will fly round, stunning all the enemies, releasing more charged bolts, and blowing them all up. So we essentially get to have the same synergy in two different flavors, which means we can do it way more often, so we're never really waiting around for a cooldown to be up, despite playing this in such a way that we essentially never have to hardcast charge bolts unless we are against a boss. It's on the bars because it might as well be, because it is our offensive move here, and ultimately the flow of this build is very simple. Teleport on a group of enemies, they all just blow up because that's the point. Then we move to the next group of enemies, they get the lightning spear, which will blow them all up. There we go. And now teleport is back off cooldown, so we can teleport to the next group of enemies and blow them up, and so on and so forth as you move through. If you ever want, yeah, you're fine to just cast it normally, that's all well and good. Oh, next group of enemies, alright, teleport on top of them, they're going to blow up. Next group, cool, they get the lightning spear, and just, oh, that moment when everyone just dies without you doing anything other than pressing these two cooldowns. I hope you are grinning as much as I do while both seeing this and maybe using it yourself if you choose to give it a go. But just this whole boom, it's so good. Oh, I love it. And it certainly doesn't hurt that charged bolts actually does hit really hard. So if you ever actually cast it or have to cast it, you're not going to regret it. It's been buffed a couple times, and on top of Barber, which is of course in play here, that really adds to this whole timed bomb detonation playstyle, you really do start to see some absurd numbers. So let's talk aspects and such. Weapon then, yes, Staff of Lamb Esen. You could get away with not having it if you want to focus more on casting charge bolts over the teleport lightning spear gimmick, but I mean, this is just too much fun to pass up, and it has been proven really, really solid for me. And I've got a really bad roll too, in fact, the worst one. In any case, this simply lets your charge bolts pierce through enemies, which is really important, because if you are stack grouping a huge amount of enemies with your teleport, and then they all release the bolts from the enchantment, you want them to pass through and then hit other enemies in the stack, all of which is multiple times, causing this passive Nova to go off, stacking and stacking and stacking the damage, especially into the Barber. So piercing really is kind of key to this whole thing, coupled with the other key aspect that we'll go straight to, which is static cling. We've got it on your necklace because, again, you want this to happen as often as possible, and it means your charge bolts have a chance to last triple time, which is great, but also attract and home to enemies. So the combination of this, the enchantment, and your teleport means you can teleport on a group of enemies, release a swarm of long-lasting, homing, piercing charged bolts that just wipe the screen for you, and when that happens, oh, it is absolutely mesmerizing. It really, really is. So after the core pair, we go to Esu's Heirloom, just for the extra crit chance and movement speed. It just makes everything flow, and we don't really need anything else from our boots here. Now we then go to Disobedience, just for the damage reduction. It's hard to argue against this in most every build. On our gloves, we do have Accelerating. For the few times that we do actually need to cast this, it helps mitigate the slower attack speed of the staff, and it's a good use of an aspect slot. Then Raiment to the Infinite, mandatory for this whole shtick to work. We need that pull, grab, stun to trigger everything, and then this, Shared Misery. This is super important, because we want to stun everyone all of the time to fuel everything. This means that Lightning Spear is doing what it does, because it will stun an enemy, and then Shared Misery will make that it stuns an enemy at the other side of the screen, which will then trigger the charged bolts to go off, and they might trigger your passive that stuns more enemies, and so on and so forth. It just keeps everything stunned all of the time, which means it keeps everything dead all of the time. Then we have ourselves your extra crit chance when you cast above 100 mana. This is nice, but it is something that I would actually recommend replacing with prodigies. The reason being is I don't have a good prodigies, so I've sort of just left it here as an example, but you will probably find that on bosses where this does does definitely struggle compared to Ice Shards or Arclash. You need the extra mana help, and you'll get more out of a high roll Prodigies than you will the Elementalists. This is nice, and it does seemingly affect the charge bolts that come out of the enchantment, but yeah, if you find your boss damage is lacking, and it might be, then swap this for Prodigies and you'll be good to go. Then, lastly, we of course get Control. This is all about damaging enemies while they're stunned, so this is just a huge increase to damaging stunned enemies. It is at this point you're probably asking yourself, why not the Oculus? Well, a couple reasons. Firstly, we need the piercing of Lam Esen, and secondly, we don't want random teleports. If this didn't have the random element, I could definitely see an argument for using it and giving up piercing just to be able to trigger the whole thing more often, but it's just not better. It's as simple as that. We lose too much and gain too little from randomly teleporting. It would be nice to have the teleport enchantment, but it's not nicer than both the burning enchantment from Firebolt and, you know, the charged bolts enchantment that powers the whole thing. So sadly, bottom line, it just makes the build worse and ironically slower, as much as I would love to actually have this thing be good. So, Malignant Hearts are next, and yes, the Barber. This is what really pushes Teleport Bomb over the edge, because you've teleported, you've done loads of charged bolts, you have built up damage from many sources of all the synergies, and now it's compounding and stacking and about to explode again on the now grouped Raiment enemies. This really does take it to that next ticking time literal bomb level, and as you've been seeing, it works super well, as Barber works super well in everything, but it's especially thematic here. Then we want to get Pikana. This is so good. We're critting everything all of the time, stunning it, all of it starts sparking more electricity, stacking more Barber, and again, you are group stunning a huge amount of enemies with Raiment. They're now all sparking on each other with Pikana, and you just see how it layers the damage. Then the ever-reliable Tel Rashes for that stacking increase that's permanently up. Sadly, we only get 3 stacks, Shadow from Barber, Lightning and Fire, but that still makes it very much worthwhile. So your gems, you want crit damage to vulnerable enemies, mainly for boss, and the extra health from your rubies. Affix-wise, this one is quite straightforward. Number 1, you want cooldown reduction, as much of it as you can get, so you can teleport and lightning spear as often as possible. Max rolls everywhere that you can. Past that, ranks of Devouring Blaze, ranks of Charged Bolts, ranks of defensive skills. Then crit chance, then crit damage, lightning crit damage. Then resource gen, extra max mana, basically all of your mana cost reduction, your mana management for your single target when you're actually casting Charged Bolts. After that, lucky hit, and vulnerable damage, and then int and all of your others like close damage, etc, etc. Very kind of simple to follow on that one. If we have a look at what I'm actually sat at, 40% crit chance is really, really good here. Do want my crit damage to be a bit higher, but it is above 100 if we include with Lightning 2, which is just as applicable in this situation. And then cooldown reduction. It's sad, isn't it? It really, really is. I need to have it on my amulet, and I don't. I've just got it from my helm. Because we're using the staff, we don't get the offhand cooldown reduction. Get more than I have, try and reach 20%, and it will get even better. So, let's actually talk Paragon then and round this out, because the Paragon tree for this is quite nice. Starting at the first board, because, I mean, yeah, we have to. We go up through here and grab Enchanter. We just want this to give us as much non-physical damage as possible. There is so much intelligence within range of this, especially once you get it to the increased size, and it is a huge spike to pump it as much as you can, so definitely do that. And when you have more points than me, spare points, just grab all the intelligence you can from around the place here. Then we move up, and we want to end up in our Burning Instinct Synergy board. We go over here, get the Smoldering Embers, and then the Cinders too, eventually spiking out up here to get Kindling. Occasionally, you will want to go up here when you have the spare points to get the Armor and more damage reduction, reduction, and that is really nice, but sadly I do not. And then glyph-wise, control. That is the second most important glyph. This is all about damaging stunned enemies, so this is a big increase for us. Then we head up and left out of here to, yes, as you might expect, the static surge, the stun damage board. We want to initially get this cluster here, incapacitate, and unlock the glyph slot, where we will put more crit damage, as we are doing a lot of crit damage, and then veer off up here to get the overwhelming cluster, and then get static surge for the mana regen on close enemies. It'll mean you never run out, so you can just throw in your charge bolt casts as you move along if you need to, or have a spare moment, or just to make elites die a little bit quicker. Then we go down here and come across to get the paralyzing cluster, more stun damage, the extra max mana is nice, and then you will go up and out into your vulnerable board, your frigid fate. This is where I kind of run out of points, but initially you'll grab the oppressive cluster and then go over to your glyph slot and then grab the weakness cluster. In this glyph slot, you want the usual tactician just to amp this vulnerable node as much as you can, and the defensive skill damage increase is ever useful. So that is that, and gives you a fair amount of points to be getting on with, and well, that's the build. I think it's a really fun, fresh, interesting, and just overall satisfying way to play Sorcerer that takes huge amounts of advantage of how much frequently we can stun enemies and how that means they're just dead because of it. And it's nice to use a skill that isn't used very often, but using it in a very different way than just casting it, as it's coming mostly from the stuns thanks to Teleport and Lightning Spear. Basically, this thing rules, and it is just supreme for clearing content both in the overworld and your kind of levelish for XP and legendary farming in dungeons. I heartily recommend giving it a try, and I am so pleased that I finally made my goal, my dream of the teleport bomb a reality. For now then, like you enjoyed this, subscribe and hit the bell for more. Consider supporting the future of the channel on Patreon down below, and until we meet again, a goodbye.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.